No one ever really noticed the boy before the fire. He was just another drifter in a town too dry for mercy and too tired for stories. Dust clung to his boots, hunger to his ribs, and silence to his name. He had nothing to offer the world, nothing but a crust of bread, hardened from days of being untouched. But one evening, under the fading gold of a desert sun, he saw a figure watching from the ridge. Not a threat, not a friend, a shadow of something older, deeper. Apache. The townsfolk warned him to stay clear. They don't forgive, and they don't forget, they said. Their silence cuts deeper than steel. But the boy didn't have fear left in him, just instinct. So when he saw the Apache elder by the dying campfire, alone and worn, he reached into his coat and broke the bread in half. No words were exchanged, just a gesture, one half extended, one half accepted. And that single moment, raw, human, and quiet, rippled through the night like a hymn whispered to the canyon walls. By morning, everything had changed. The tribe returned, silent, painted, proud. They did not speak his name. They did not question his reasons. Instead, they handed him something sacred, a crimson handkerchief, lined with black thread and marked with symbols only the old ones could read. The boy didn't understand the weight of what he held, but his hands trembled, all the same. It wasn't just cloth. It was memory. It was history. It was honor. And that's when the whispers began. In the saloon, they said he was marked. In the church, they said he'd been chosen. But no one, not even the sheriff, dared take it from him. Because the West had rules, yes. But older than bullets, older than borders, was the law of respect. And anyone who earned the trust of the Apache was no longer just a boy. He hadn't been searching for legend. He hadn't been chasing fate. All he'd done was offer half a loaf of bread to a stranger. But in the Old West, where every action echoes for generations, that was enough to change everything. The boy's name was Caleb, though few ever bothered to ask. His father had died with a pickaxe in his hands, digging for gold that wasn't there. His mother vanished into the desert one winter night, chasing salvation or madness. No one could tell the difference. Caleb stayed behind, working odd jobs, sleeping in barns, and learning to keep his head down. In a town that looked the other way when someone starved, he survived by not being seen. Until that fire. Until that piece of bread. The Apache man he approached that night wasn't just any wanderer. He was known in the hills as Red Elk, one of the last remaining elders of a tribe nearly erased by treaties and bullets. He had come down from the mountain, they said, to bury a brother lost in the last freeze. He hadn't spoken to a white man in over a decade. And yet, he took the bread. Not with suspicion, but with stillness. As if he recognized something in Caleb that time hadn't managed to corrode. When Caleb woke the next day and saw the tribe waiting just beyond the creek, he thought he was dreaming. The horses were painted. The men wore feathers, beads, and silence. And Red Elk stood at the center, holding the crimson handkerchief as if it were a flame. Caleb stepped forward cautiously, unsure of the rules he was now part of. The moment Red Elk placed the cloth in his hand, the others bowed their heads, not out of submission, but remembrance. That handkerchief wasn't a gift. It was a story passed down in fabric and thread. It meant that Caleb had been witnessed, not judged, not used, but seen. In a world that had discarded him as worthless, that tiny square of cloth weighed more than any title or coin. And though he didn't yet understand the language embroidered into it, he understood the eyes watching him. And he knew he had crossed into something sacred. The townspeople reacted with a fear that masked itself as anger. You don't know what that means. One man spat at him outside the blacksmith's. They're dangerous. But Caleb said nothing. He tied the cloth around his wrist like a band of fire and kept walking. For the first time in his life, he walked with purpose. He didn't belong to the town anymore. He belonged to something older and infinitely more honorable. In the days that followed, Caleb noticed things others missed. The wind shifted before sunset. Coyotes howled in different rhythms. And when he passed the river bend near dusk, he'd see shadows that vanished the moment he looked directly at them. He didn't speak of it, not to the barkeep, not to the preacher, not even to the one friend he had, a half-blind stable boy named Micah. Some things weren't meant to be explained. They were meant to be carried. Micah noticed the change. "You're different," he said one night while brushing down a mule. Caleb nodded. I feel different. He didn't mention the way his dreams had started to pulse with colors he couldn't describe, or how he sometimes woke up with words in his head that weren't his own. The handkerchief was more than a symbol. It was a thread tying him to a forgotten world, and that world was slowly pulling him in. Then, one morning, a stranger arrived in town, a bounty hunter draped in leather, with a face that looked carved from bark. He pinned a wanted poster to the saloon door, Red Elk's face sketched in rough charcoal. $10 alive. 5 dead, it read. The town buzzed with curiosity. Greedy eyes scanned the hills. But Caleb froze. He knew what it meant. Red Elk had trusted him, and now someone wanted to cash in on that trust with lead. Caleb didn't hesitate. He packed what little he had, an old revolver, a loaf of bread, a canteen, and vanished into the foothills before sunrise. He followed the old paths, the ones barely visible, marked only by stone piles and broken branches. He didn't call out. He simply waited, quietly, until the eyes revealed themselves again. The Apache didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. His presence alone, in the wild, carrying their cloth, was his answer. Red Elk appeared like smoke through the trees. He didn't scold or question. He simply handed Caleb a stick burned with markings, directions, symbols, a path only the tribe could follow. Caleb took it and nodded. He had no idea what waited ahead, only that there was no going back. The boy who once broke bread had now broken rank with the world he came from, and the desert was watching what he'd become. The trail Red Elk marked wasn't straight. It wasn't meant to be. It weaved through thorn brush and dry gulches, past canyons where echoes told secrets older than names. Caleb followed it without question, guided more by instinct than knowledge. He slept beneath mesquite trees, drank from springs the maps didn't show, and listened to the wind as if it were whispering directions. The handkerchief remained tied around his wrist, frayed now, but no less powerful. It had become a part of him. On the 4th night, he found the fire. Hidden in a cave carved into the rock like a wound, the Apache gathered without words. They acknowledged him with nods, not smiles. This was not a reunion. It was a reckoning. A choice had been made when Caleb stepped into the hills. He was no longer a bystander. He was one who carried a mark, one that came with weight. Red Elk sat across the flames and finally spoke. "You broke bread," he said, "and bread given freely opens doors no blade can force." The days that followed became a kind of trial. Caleb was not tested with violence, but with memory. He was made to watch the dances, to walk the sacred grounds at dawn, to listen as stories were told not with mouths, but with drums and smoke. He saw how their world had been carved away piece by piece, not by war, but by forgetting. The ceremonial handkerchief was a thread to their ancestors, and they had given it to him not as an outsider, but as a messenger. One evening, Red Elk handed him a carved wooden object, light as a feather but shaped like a feathered wing. "You will return," he said, "but not as who you were." Caleb didn't understand then, but he would, because legacy isn't something you wear like a badge. It's something you carry when no one else will. And in the silence that followed, he realized the tribe had given him their most dangerous gift, remembrance. By the time Caleb made his way back toward town, something had changed in him, subtle, yet irreversible. His walk was no longer cautious. His eyes no longer scanned for approval. He returned not as a boy, not as a stranger, but as someone who held stories too old to speak. And the town, though it looked the same, felt suddenly smaller. Because once you've stood in the sacred quiet of forgotten people, no noise can ever shake you again. Caleb's reappearance didn't go unnoticed. He entered town at high noon, not with fanfare, but with stillness. The same people who had once dismissed him now watched from behind curtains, their curiosity tangled with unease. No one asked where he'd been. No one dared. But they saw the feather-shaped talisman tied beside the crimson handkerchief, and knew something had passed beyond their understanding. Even the sheriff, old and leathery, tipped his hat and said nothing. That night, a fire broke out behind the livery stable. Flames rose high, hungry and wild. Caleb was the first to see it. Without pause, he charged into the barn, cutting reins, freeing horses, pulling Micah out from under a fallen beam. He moved like someone who didn't fear death, like someone who had already made peace with it in the desert. When the flames died, people whispered, "He saved half the town." But Caleb never said a word. He just walked away, hands black with soot, eyes calm. The next morning, he found a bundle left at his door. Inside was a hand-woven sash, the kind worn only by the old Apache warriors during rites of passage. No note, no explanation. But Caleb understood. The tribe had seen what he did, even from afar. They were always watching, always remembering. And now, they had named him in the only way they knew how, through action, not ceremony. But honor, especially in the West, comes with enemies. The bounty hunter returned, this time with a new poster. Caleb's name now inked below Red Elk's. Harboring tribal fugitives. $5 alive. 10 if he talks. It wasn't just a price. It was a message. The system hadn't forgotten him, and it never forgave those who chose sides against it. Caleb stared at the poster for a long time. Then, without a word, he tore it down and set it ablaze with a match. By nightfall, he stood once more at the edge of town, staring into the dark ridges beyond. The road ahead would not be peaceful, but he wasn't afraid. He had something stronger than fear, purpose, and in the Old West, that was rarer than gold. As the stars emerged over the ridge, Caleb rode out of town alone, not in retreat, but in defiance. He left behind the whispers, the warnings, and the wanted posters pinned to every wall. The red handkerchief still hung from his wrist, flapping softly in the wind, like a flag the world didn't recognize. But he didn't ride for recognition. He rode because he had been given something far more sacred than identity. He had been trusted with memory. The Apache were waiting for him in the shadow of the red cliffs, where the rocks bled at sunrise and glowed like fire at dusk. This time, they welcomed him not with nods, but with open arms. Red Elk placed a hand over Caleb's chest and spoke one word in his native tongue, a word that meant keeper. Caleb didn't know the full translation, but he felt it, deep in his bones. He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a bearer of something worth protecting. That night, around the ceremonial fire, Caleb listened to stories etched into the rhythm of drums. Tales of warriors who never returned. Women who sang the stars down from the sky. Children who learned to track the wind before they learned to speak. Each story was placed in the air like a fragile bird, and Caleb, sitting in the glow, knew that if he ever betrayed their trust, those stories would vanish forever. But not all ears in the desert were friendly. From across the valley, eyes watched through the sagebrush. Hired guns, drawn by the bounty, hungry for coin and untouched by meaning. They didn't understand the symbols. They didn't care about the rituals. All they saw was a boy among shadows, and a price written on his name. Caleb felt it before anyone spoke. A weight in the air, a quiet too deep to ignore. Trouble wasn't far. The next morning, Red Elk handed him a bow. Not a fight, but to carry. They will come with bullets, he said. You will answer with memory. Caleb didn't argue. He strapped the bow to his back and looked once more at the horizon. He had come into this world with nothing but a crust of bread. And now, he walked with a legacy. The kind that couldn't be stolen, bought, or sold. Only lived. And in the West, that kind of wealth made you the most dangerous man alive. The attack came just before dawn, when the sky still slept and the ground hadn't yet shaken off the cold. 3 riders. Paid hands. Faces wrapped in cloth. Rifles slung low. They didn't shout. They didn't warn. They came like ghosts with iron hearts. But the Apache were already ready. Not with an army, but with knowledge. They had seen this pattern before, and they knew how to meet it, with strategy, silence, and unity. Caleb didn't run. He stood beside the fire pit, bow in hand, heart pounding like hooves across dry dirt. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed to protect. As the first shot echoed through the canyon, the tribe moved like water, slipping between trees, circling the attackers, forcing them to fire into shadows that disappeared as fast as they came. Caleb drew, loosed, and watched an arrow slice through the morning mist, landing at a rider's feet. Not a warning. A message. You don't belong here. The fight didn't last long. It never did when the land fought on your side. The riders fled, one limping, one without a horse, the third dragging behind, half conscious from a fall down the ridge. Caleb didn't celebrate. He knelt instead, fingers pressed into the earth, offering thanks, not for victory, but for guidance. Red Elk stood beside him and nodded. Now they will speak your name, he said, not in fear, but in memory. Back at the fire that night, the tribe circled Caleb. A young girl approached him, barely old enough to carry a clay pot, and handed him a strand of beads, blue and white, with a single stone dyed red. "From the weavers," she said. "For the one who remembered." Caleb tied it beside the handkerchief, letting both symbols rest over his heart. They were different, but together they told a single story: a boy who gave bread and received a tribe. In town, rumors spread faster than the wind. Some said he was now Apache. Others said he had magic in his hands. But none dared go after him again. Because in the West, when the land itself chooses someone, the wise step back, and the foolish vanish without a trace. Caleb had been chosen not by force, not by blood, but by something older than both. Something eternal. Caleb's name became legend, not in saloons or newspapers, but in the quiet language of the wind and in the soft murmurs of elders sitting around fires. He no longer belonged to the pathless crowd of forgotten boys who once begged for scraps and slept beneath borrowed roofs. He had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of reverence. In a world where memory was currency and silence held more truth than a sermon, Caleb had become rich beyond measure. Each day, he woke before the sun and walked alone through the canyons, learning the terrain the way one memorizes a prayer. He knew which trees bled sap that healed burns. He knew which birds warned of coming riders. And most of all, he learned to listen, not to respond, but to understand. The Apache didn't teach with lectures. They taught through endurance, through sweat, through earned silence. Caleb absorbed it all as if he'd been born from it. One morning, Red Elk brought him a faded hide, marked with symbols too old to trace. "This is where our fathers bled," he said. "One day, someone will ask where yours stood. What will you answer?" Caleb stared at the cloth for a long time. Then he folded it gently, pressed it to his forehead, and whispered the only promise he could make: "Wherever I walk, they'll know I didn't forget." And in the West, remembering was the greatest loyalty one could offer. Back in town, the preacher delivered a sermon about lost sons and strange gods. He didn't mention Caleb by name, but the meaning was clear. Some people feared what they couldn't define. But Micah, the stable boy, stood in the back of the church, clutching a small wooden carving Caleb had left him, a hawk in flight, wings wide, heart exposed. And as the preacher spoke of damnation, Micah simply smiled. Because he knew what the townspeople didn't, Caleb wasn't lost. He had simply outgrown the borders of their understanding. That night, Caleb stood at the edge of a cliff, red handkerchief fluttering in the breeze, feather talisman resting on his chest, and beads glinting softly in the moonlight. Below him, the fire in the canyon burned low. Behind him, the path back to town stretched empty. But ahead, far ahead, was nothing but wilderness, starlight, and the quiet promise of a new kind of legacy. One not written in law books or land deeds, but in the hearts of those who still dared to remember. As the seasons turned, Caleb became more than a memory among the tribe. He became part of their rhythm. He helped plant in spring, gather in fall, defend in the quiet threats of summer. He learned the songs sung only when someone returned from a vision quest. He sat with the elders in the coldest nights, listening to stories passed down like sacred breath, fragile and alive. And in return, he shared what little he carried: names of rivers on maps, the lies printed in books, and stories of his own childhood, stained by abandonment. Red Elk grew slower with time. His hands, once strong enough to carve bone, trembled as he traced the patterns in the sand. One evening, he summoned Caleb beside the fire and placed something heavy in his palm, a small stone wrapped in sinew, etched with the symbol of the great hawk. "When I go," he said softly, "bury this with me, and keep walking." Caleb felt a knot form in his chest. He had gained so much, but the West never gave without asking for something in return. Weeks later, Red Elk passed during the night, face turned to the stars, lips parted in a silent chant only he could hear. The tribe mourned not with wails, but with stillness. Caleb dug the grave himself. No shovel, just hands, just earth. And when the stone was finally placed, he sat beside it until dawn. That morning, the canyon was quieter than ever. And for the first time, Caleb cried. Not from grief alone, but from the sacred weight of carrying someone else's story forward. After the burial, the youngest members of the tribe approached him with feathers and paints. They marked his face, not as an outsider, not as a guest, but as one who had endured, one who had honored, one who now carried the name, not of blood, but of spirit. He wasn't trying to become Apache. He never claimed what wasn't his. But what he had become was something beyond the old words, a bridge between worlds no one else had dared to stand upon. And so Caleb stayed, not forever, not in body, but in essence. He rode from village to village, canyon to canyon, carrying stories, trading bread for silence, handkerchief tied to his arm like a flag of peace. Some laughed, some stared, but the wise looked twice, because they knew the truth. Boys who offer bread to the forgotten often find themselves entrusted with something far greater, memory that refuses to die. In time, Caleb's legend grew, not because he spoke of it, but because he never did. Wherever he went, people remembered the quiet boy who rode alone, whose presence made even the loudest saloon hush for a breath. He carried no gun at his side, but his eyes had the weight of 1,000 battles. Children watched him pass and whispered stories they couldn't trace. Some said he spoke to animals. Others claimed he never slept. But those who looked closer saw only one thing: reverence. He found himself once at the edge of a broken town, where the church had no bell and the well had no water. A settler's wife stood in the dust with a child too weak to cry. Caleb gave them the last of his bread, just as he had done years ago beside Red Elk's fire. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't stay for recognition. He left behind a feather pressed into the child's hand. When the woman tried to follow and ask who he was, an old rancher simply said, "He's the one who listens." Far beyond the borders of maps, Caleb returned each year to the burial site in the Red Cliffs. Not out of ritual, but remembrance. He brought offerings, fresh water, woven cloth, songs hummed under his breath. He never stayed long. He never spoke aloud, but he always left something behind. And each time, the wind seemed to answer, not with words, but with peace, as if the land itself remembered him. By now, his red handkerchief had faded to rust, and the feathered talisman had lost its shape. But he never removed them. He wore them not as trophies, but as truth. In a world that tried to take everything from him, they were reminders of what could never be stolen. Trust, honor, story. They were his armor, not to shield him, but to remind him why he stood. Years later, a young man came riding through the same trails Caleb once walked barefoot. He asked for him by name. He carried nothing but bread and a journal worn thin by wind and ash. When he arrived at a fire deep in the canyon, the tribe welcomed him as if he had always belonged. Because legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what you pass forward. And Caleb had passed forward something indestructible. Time, in the West, does not forget the ones who carried it with respect. Caleb's story became part of the soil, not just spoken, but sung, etched into rock, and whispered through smoke. Those who once called him a boy without a future now spoke his name as a bridge between worlds. The child who had once been overlooked in a town too proud to look inward had become the keeper of its most sacred truth, that peace isn't begged for, it's earned, piece by piece, through sacrifice and presence. They say in some places, his figure still appears at twilight, not as a ghost, not as a hero, but as a reminder that greatness doesn't wear a crown or ride a stallion. It carries water to the weary. It breaks bread without condition. It listens, even when no one speaks. And it leaves behind no statue, but thousands of silent echoes that shape the way others live. Some believe he died alone in the desert, bow in hand, eyes open to the stars. Others say he simply walked farther than anyone dared, into a canyon no map could reach, where the stories never end and the fire never dies. But everyone agrees on one thing. Wherever he went, the land grew quieter. The people stood taller, and the stories grew stronger. Because Caleb wasn't just a boy who shared bread with the forgotten. He became the memory they entrusted to the world. And in a time when silence was survival and history was too often erased by flame, he chose to carry it anyway. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And so his story lives, not in headlines, not in books, but in every quiet act of courage done when no one is watching. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the air feels ancient and the wind seems to pause, look closely. You just might see a faded red cloth hanging from tree, and know that you've stepped on a sacred ground. In a land shaped by silence and survival, where names are often lost to dust, Caleb's story endures not because he sought glory, but because he lived with purpose. He began with nothing but a half loaf of bread and a quiet instinct to share it. And yet, that small act, so simple, so human, opened a door into a world older than maps, deeper than borders. Through that gesture, he was not only welcomed, he was transformed. Caleb didn't chase legends. He honored them. He didn't speak loudly, but everything he did echoed with meaning. The red handkerchief tied around his wrist was never about pride. It was about promise. A promise to remember, to protect, and to carry forward a legacy that others tried to erase. And while the West has buried countless stories in its canyons and sands, Caleb's became one of the few that refused to disappear. His life reminds us that sometimes the most powerful journey begins not with a horse or a gun, but with empathy. That the fiercest warriors are often the quietest souls, the ones who listen more than they speak, who choose to stand with the forgotten rather than seek approval from the comfortable. In a world still divided by fear and difference, Caleb's path calls us back to something essential: the choice to see, to share, and to protect what others might never understand. So ask yourself, what would you do with your last piece of bread? Would you hold it close or offer it to someone the world has cast aside? That answer, more than any weapon or title, may define the legacy you leave behind. Because in the end, greatness is not measured by how many follow you, but by how many are changed because you chose to walk beside them. If Caleb's journey moved you, let that emotion guide your next step. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because every story remembered is one step closer to a world that listens, honors, and never forgets.